High in the mist-shrouded peaks of northern Montana, where ancient pines stretch toward heaven and morning fog clings to rocky outcrops like ghostly fingers, there once stood a place that promised salvation to the desperate and lost. St. Benedict's Monastery of Eternal Rest wasn't just another religious retreat hidden away from the world. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was something far more sinister, a place where hope went to die, and where the line between salvation and damnation became horrifyingly blurred. For nearly 2 decades, from 1889 to 1908, this remote sanctuary drew broken souls from across the American frontier. Men and women fleeing poverty, addiction, family disgrace, or simply the crushing weight of existence itself. They came seeking peace, redemption, and a chance to start anew. What they found instead was something that would shock the nation when the truth finally emerged. 189 people entered those monastery gates seeking spiritual healing. None of them ever left alive. The mountain winds still carry whispers of their final moments, or so the locals claim. Stories of midnight screams echoing through the valleys, of strange lights flickering in the monastery windows long after the evening prayers should have ended, and of a peculiar sweet smell that would drift down from those heights whenever the wind blew just right. The smell, investigators would later discover, was the scent of human decay masked by burning incense and medicinal herbs. What made St. Benedict's Monastery particularly effective as a killing ground wasn't just its isolation. Though the nearest town of Copper Falls was a grueling 3-day ride through treacherous mountain passes, it was the carefully constructed reputation that Brother Marcus Whitmore and his inner circle had built over the years. They had created the perfect trap, baited with promises of spiritual renewal, and positioned in a location where screams would never reach civilized ears. The monastery's origins traced back to 1887, when Marcus Whitmore, a former Methodist minister from Ohio, arrived in Montana territory with grand visions of establishing a haven for society's outcasts. Whitmore was a man of impressive physical presence, standing well over 6 feet tall with piercing blue eyes and a voice that could command attention in any room. His charisma was undeniable, but beneath that magnetic exterior lurked something far darker than his early followers could have imagined. Whitmore had fled Ohio under circumstances that remain murky to this day. Church records suggest there had been allegations of financial impropriety and inappropriate conduct with female parishioners, but no formal charges were ever filed. Whatever drove him west, he carried with him an encyclopedic knowledge of Scripture, a gift for manipulation that bordered on supernatural, and most dangerously, an absolute conviction that he was destined for greatness regardless of the cost in human lives. The early years of St. Benedict's Monastery were marked by legitimate religious activity. Whitmore and his small band of followers, mostly men who had been drawn to his powerful sermons during his journey west, worked tirelessly to construct the main buildings and establish the routines of monastic life. The centerpiece was an impressive stone chapel built from local granite, its spire visible for miles across the mountain landscape. Surrounding the chapel were dormitories, a refectory, workshops, and most importantly, the infirmary where so many visitors would meet their final moments. Brother Thomas Caldwell served as Whitmore's second-in-command and chief enforcer. A former soldier who had served in the Indian Wars, Caldwell brought military discipline and a casual attitude toward violence that proved invaluable to their later activities. His weathered face bore the scars of frontier warfare, and his cold gray eyes seemed to evaluate every person he met as either useful or expendable. Unlike Whitmore, who maintained the facade of spiritual leadership, Caldwell made no pretense about his willingness to use force when necessary. Brother Samuel Green handled the monastery's medical operations, though his qualifications were questionable at best. Green claimed to have studied medicine at a prestigious Eastern university, but investigators would later discover he had never completed any formal medical training. What he did possess was an extensive knowledge of poisons derived from native plants and a complete lack of conscience when it came to administering them. His soft-spoken manner and apparent dedication to healing made him the perfect wolf in shepherd's clothing. Brother David Morrison managed the monastery's financial affairs and served as their primary recruiter. Morrison had a background in banking and possessed the social skills necessary to identify and approach potential victims in nearby towns. His respectable appearance and earnest manner made him an effective ambassador for the monastery, able to convince desperate people that St. Benedict's offered exactly what they needed most. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The transformation from legitimate religious community to killing operation began. Gradually in late 1888, the monastery was struggling financially, and the harsh Montana winters were taking their toll on both buildings and inhabitants. It was during this period of crisis that the first accident occurred, an event that would set the pattern for nearly 2 decades of systematic murder. Brother Jonathan Hayes was a genuine seeker who had joined the monastery early in its existence. Hayes suffered from what would now be recognized as severe depression, and despite months of prayer and spiritual counseling, his condition continued to deteriorate. One December morning, his body was discovered at the bottom of a steep ravine behind the monastery, apparently having fallen while walking in the pre-dawn darkness. His death was ruled accidental by the local sheriff, but more importantly, it provided Whitmore and his associates with a crucial insight. Hayes had carried with him nearly $400 in gold coins, his life savings intended as a donation to support the monastery's mission. His death solved their immediate financial crisis and suggested a solution to their long-term sustainability problem. More telling still was the reaction of Hayes' family back in Pennsylvania. Rather than demanding an investigation or the return of his remains, they seemed almost relieved that their troubled relative had found peace, even in death. The psychological profile of their future victims was established in that moment. The shift toward predatory behavior accelerated through 1889 as word spread about the monastery's supposed healing abilities. Whitmore began crafting carefully worded advertisements that appeared in newspapers throughout the Mountain West, targeting specific types of individuals who would be unlikely to be missed. The advertisements spoke of final rest for weary souls, healing for those beyond conventional help, and sanctuary for society's forgotten children. The language was deliberately ambiguous, offering hope to the desperate while providing legal cover for what was essentially a recruitment campaign for murder victims. By the spring of 1889, the monastery had established a routine that would remain consistent throughout their killing years. Potential victims were identified through Morrison's recruitment efforts or through responses to their newspaper advertisements. These individuals were invited to spend time at the monastery for spiritual healing and renewal, with the understanding that they would contribute financially to support the community's work. Once isolated at the mountain retreat, they were gradually separated from any outside contacts and systematically exploited until their usefulness was exhausted. The physical layout of St. Benedict's Monastery was perfectly designed for their deadly purposes. The main chapel dominated the central courtyard, surrounded by various functional buildings that created an enclosed compound. Visitors were housed in a separate dormitory building that could be easily monitored and controlled. Most critically, the monastery included extensive underground areas, originally intended for food storage and workshops but later converted to serve far more sinister purposes. Brother Caldwell oversaw the construction of what they euphemistically called the meditation chambers, a series of underground rooms where victims could be held indefinitely without risk of discovery. These chambers were carved directly into the mountain bedrock and accessed through a concealed entrance in the chapel basement. The rooms were equipped with heavy wooden doors, primitive ventilation systems, and most chillingly, drainage systems that could handle large quantities of liquid waste. The monastery's remote location provided perfect cover for their activities. The nearest neighbor was more than 15 miles away, and the treacherous mountain roads meant that casual visitors were virtually impossible. More importantly, the isolation allowed them to control all information flowing in and out of the compound. Letters from visitors to their families were intercepted and destroyed, while carefully crafted forgeries were sent in their place, explaining extended stays or decisions to travel to other locations. Brother Green's role as the monastery's medical officer proved crucial to their success. He developed an extensive knowledge of local plants and their toxic properties, creating a sophisticated poison arsenal that could produce symptoms ranging from gradual weakness to sudden death. His favorite weapon was a preparation derived from water hemlock, a plant common in the Montana mountains that produced symptoms closely resembling natural illness. Victims would sicken gradually over the course of several days, experiencing weakness, confusion, and eventually fatal seizures that appeared to be the result of altitude sickness or exposure. The psychological manipulation employed by Whitmore and his followers was perhaps even more effective than their physical methods. They created an environment where victims were gradually stripped of their autonomy and self-worth, becoming completely dependent on the monastery for basic needs and emotional support. This process began immediately upon arrival, with visitors encouraged to surrender their personal possessions as a gesture of commitment to their spiritual journey. New arrivals were assigned to experienced residents who served as mentors and guides, individuals who had already been broken by the monastery's psychological techniques and now served as unwitting accomplices in the destruction of others. These mentors would share stories of their own spiritual breakthroughs and encourage newcomers to embrace the monastery's increasingly demanding requirements for purification and enlightenment. The daily routine at St. Benedict's was designed to break down individual resistance and critical thinking. Visitors were awakened before dawn for lengthy prayer sessions, followed by physical labor that left them exhausted and more susceptible to manipulation. Meals were deliberately inadequate, creating a state of chronic hunger that further weakened their ability to resist psychological pressure. Most effectively, they were gradually isolated from any contact with the outside world, told that such connections represented attachments that hindered their spiritual progress. Whitmore's sermons during this period became increasingly apocalyptic and controlling. He preached that the outside world was corrupt beyond redemption and that only through complete surrender to his guidance could souls find salvation. He claimed to receive direct revelations from God about individual visitors, revelations that inevitably demanded greater sacrifices and more complete submission to the monastery's authority. Those who questioned these demands or expressed desire to leave were subjected to intensive counseling sessions designed to break their will entirely. The first confirmed murder at St. Benedict's Monastery occurred in September 1889. Though it would be years before investigators could piece together the exact sequence of events. The victim was Rebecca Patterson, a 34-year-old widow from Denver who had come to the monastery seeking healing after the loss of her husband and 2 children to typhoid fever. Patterson carried with her approximately $800 in cash and jewelry, representing the sale of her family's possessions after their deaths. Patterson's case established the template that would be followed for nearly 2 decades. She arrived at the monastery in a state of profound grief and vulnerability, exactly the psychological condition that made victims most susceptible to manipulation. During her first weeks at St. Benedict's, she was showered with attention and sympathy, made to feel that she had finally found people who truly understood her suffering. Brother Whitmore spent hours with her personally, listening to her story and offering comfort that seemed divinely inspired. As Patterson became more emotionally dependent on the monastery community, the demands for her commitment began to escalate. She was encouraged to donate increasing amounts of money to support the monastery's mission, with each contribution framed as a step toward her own spiritual healing. When her resources were finally exhausted, her usefulness to the community was declared complete, and she was ready to take the final step in her journey toward salvation. The murder itself was carried out with characteristic efficiency and concealment. Patterson was told that she had been selected for a special ceremony that would complete her spiritual transformation, a ritual that required her to spend several days in solitary meditation in the underground chambers. Once sealed in those rooms, she was systematically poisoned with Green's plant extracts, while being told that her physical suffering was merely the purification of her soul. Patterson's death was recorded in the monastery's official records as a peaceful passing following a period of intense spiritual revelation. Letters were sent to distant relatives explaining that she had chosen to be buried at the monastery in accordance with her final wishes, and that her remaining possessions had been donated to support the community's continued work. The simplicity and apparent authenticity of these explanations satisfied any casual inquiries, while the remote location made verification practically impossible. The success of Patterson's murder convinced Whitmore and his inner circle that they had discovered a sustainable model for both spiritual and financial success. The monastery could continue to attract desperate individuals seeking healing, exploit their resources through psychological manipulation, and eliminate them when their usefulness was exhausted. The remote location, carefully constructed reputation, and systematic approach to victim selection made detection virtually impossible. Over the following months, the monastery refined their techniques and expanded their operations. They developed more sophisticated methods for identifying ideal victims, improved their psychological manipulation strategies, and created more efficient systems for disposing of bodies and covering their tracks. Most importantly, they began keeping detailed records of their activities, documentation that would eventually provide investigators with a complete picture of their crimes, but which initially served to help them avoid making mistakes that might attract unwanted attention. The monastery's reputation continued to grow throughout 1890 and 1891, attracting visitors from increasingly distant locations. Whitmore's advertisements appeared in newspapers across the Western Territories, carefully crafted to appeal to specific types of vulnerable individuals. The promises of healing and renewal drew a steady stream of broken souls to the mountain retreat, each carrying the resources and psychological vulnerabilities that made them perfect victims for the monastery's deadly purposes. The winter of 1891 brought harsh storms to the Montana mountains, but inside St. Benedict's Monastery, a different kind of tempest was brewing. Brother Marcus Whitmore had spent months analyzing the success of their operation with Rebecca Patterson, and he was determined to transform what had been an opportunistic crime into a refined system of exploitation and murder. The monastery was evolving from a place of desperate improvisation into something far more terrifying. A machine designed specifically for the systematic destruction of human lives. Brother David Morrison had proven himself invaluable in identifying the perfect type of victim during his travels to nearby settlements. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot individuals who carried the specific combination of vulnerability and resources that made them ideal targets for the monastery's deadly purposes. During his visits to mining camps, railroad towns, and frontier settlements, Morrison would frequent taverns, boarding houses, and church gatherings, always listening for stories of personal tragedy, financial hardship, or social isolation. The ideal victim, Morrison discovered, was typically someone between the ages of 30 and 50 who had recently experienced a major life trauma. Widowers and widows were particularly valuable because their grief made them desperate for spiritual comfort, while their inheritance often provided substantial financial resources. Individuals suffering from chronic illnesses were equally promising, as their desperation for healing made them willing to travel great distances and pay enormous sums for the promise of miraculous recovery. Morrison maintained detailed written profiles of potential victims, noting their financial status, family connections, and psychological vulnerabilities. He paid particular attention to individuals who had few living relatives or who had become estranged from their families due to addiction, mental illness, or social disgrace. These people could disappear without generating the kind of sustained inquiry that might threaten the monastery's operations. The recruitment process itself had been refined to an art form. Morrison would approach potential victims with apparent reluctance, as if he were sharing a precious secret that he was hesitant to reveal. He would speak in hushed tones about the miraculous healings he had witnessed at St. Benedict's, always emphasizing that the monastery only accepted individuals who demonstrated genuine spiritual commitment. This artificial scarcity made people more eager to qualify for admission, leading them to reveal even more details about their personal circumstances and financial resources. Once a victim had been identified and recruited, their journey to the monastery became the first stage of their psychological manipulation. Morrison would provide detailed instructions for the treacherous mountain journey, emphasizing the spiritual significance of the physical hardships they would endure. The difficult 3-day ride through dangerous terrain was presented as a test of their commitment to spiritual transformation, a purification ritual that would prepare them for the profound changes awaiting them at St. Benedict's. Brother Thomas Caldwell had assumed responsibility for the monastery's security operations, developing protocols that ensured complete control over everyone who entered the compound. The physical layout of St. Benedict's had been modified extensively during the winter months with new construction that created what was essentially a prison disguised as a religious retreat. High stone walls surrounded the entire complex, ostensibly to provide protection from wild animals and harsh weather, but actually designed to prevent escape. The visitor dormitory had been relocated to the most isolated section of the compound, connected to the main buildings by a single narrow pathway that could be easily monitored. Caldwell had installed heavy wooden shutters on all dormitory windows, explaining to visitors that these were necessary to keep out the mountain cold, while actually ensuring that no one could signal for help or observe activities in other parts of the monastery. Most ingeniously, Caldwell had established a system of resident monitors who were responsible for watching new arrivals around the clock. These monitors were presented to visitors as spiritual mentors, assigned to guide them through their early days at the monastery, but their actual function was to report any signs of resistance, escape attempts, or suspicious behavior. The monitors themselves were carefully selected from among the monastery's most psychologically broken residents, individuals who had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that they would never question orders or show sympathy for new victims. Brother Samuel Green had expanded his poison laboratory significantly, transforming a section of the monastery's wine cellar into what amounted to a sophisticated chemistry workshop. Green had spent months experimenting with various plant and mineral toxins, developing a comprehensive arsenal of substances that could produce specific symptoms and effects depending on the monastery's needs. His detailed notes, later discovered by investigators, revealed a mind that approached murder with the methodical precision of a scientist conducting research. Green's most significant innovation was the development of what he called his signature blend, a combination of water hemlock extract, digitalis from foxglove plants, and crushed seeds from castor beans that produced a gradual decline in health over several weeks. Victims would experience increasing weakness, confusion, and physical pain while retaining enough mental clarity to continue making financial contributions to the monastery. The progression of symptoms could be controlled precisely by adjusting dosages, allowing Green to time deaths according to the monastery's operational needs. The poison was typically administered through the monastery's communal meals, though Green had also developed methods for introducing toxins through medicinal teas, communion wine, and even aromatic oils used during religious ceremonies. The beauty of his system was that victims experienced their declining health as part of their spiritual journey, interpreting physical suffering as evidence of their souls being purified through divine intervention. Brother Whitmore had refined his psychological manipulation techniques to an extraordinary degree, developing what amounted to a systematic program for breaking down individual resistance and critical thinking. New arrivals were subjected to an intensive orientation process that began immediately upon their arrival at the monastery. They were told that their previous lives represented spiritual death, and that only through complete surrender to God's will, as interpreted by Whitmore, could they hope to achieve true salvation. The daily routine at St. Benedict's was carefully designed to create psychological dependency while extracting maximum financial benefit from each victim. Visitors were awakened at 4 a.m. for communal prayers that lasted until dawn, leaving them exhausted before the day had even begun. Breakfast consisted of watery porridge and weak tea, deliberately insufficient to maintain proper nutrition and energy levels. The morning hours were devoted to manual labor, presented as spiritual discipline. Visitors worked in the monasteries, gardens, chopped wood for the extensive heating systems, and performed maintenance tasks on the buildings and grounds. This physical labor served multiple purposes. It kept victims too tired to think clearly about their situation. It contributed economically to the monastery's operations, and it provided opportunities for Whitmore to observe individual personalities and identify the best approaches for psychological manipulation. Afternoon sessions were devoted to what Whitmore called spiritual counseling, intensive one-on-one meetings where victims were encouraged to confess their deepest fears, shame, and regrets. Whitmore would listen with apparent compassion while carefully probing for information about the visitor's financial resources, family relationships, and psychological vulnerabilities. These sessions created an artificial sense of intimacy and trust that made victims more susceptible to increasingly demanding requests for money and commitment. Evening activities centered around communal worship services that grew more intense and emotionally manipulative as victims spent more time at the monastery. Whitmore's sermons during this period focused heavily on themes of unworthiness, divine judgment, and the necessity of complete surrender to achieve salvation. He would single out individual visitors for public confession sessions, forcing them to reveal embarrassing personal details while the entire community watched and offered apparent forgiveness and support. The case of Martin Douglas illustrated how effectively the monastery's refined system could extract resources from victims while maintaining complete psychological control. Douglas was a 42-year-old banker from Salt Lake City who had embezzled nearly $2,000 from his employer to cover gambling debts. Rather than face criminal prosecution and social disgrace, Douglas had fled Utah with his stolen money, desperately seeking a place where he could start over with a clean slate. Morrison encountered Douglas in a Helena tavern in March 1892, immediately recognizing him as an ideal victim. Douglas was carrying substantial cash, had no family members who would search for him, and was psychologically devastated by his criminal behavior and social fall from grace. Morrison approached Douglas with his usual technique, expressing sympathy for the banker's obvious distress, while gradually revealing information about the monastery's supposed ability to provide spiritual healing for even the most serious moral failures. Douglas arrived at St. Benedict's Monastery in early April, immediately impressed by the apparent serenity and spiritual dedication of the community. Whitmore spent extensive time with Douglas during his first week, listening to his confession with apparent understanding and assuring him that God's forgiveness was available to anyone willing to make the necessary sacrifices for spiritual purification. Douglas was told that his criminal behavior had been divinely orchestrated to bring him to the monastery, where his true spiritual destiny could be fulfilled. The financial extraction from Douglas followed the monastery's established pattern, but was executed with particular sophistication. Rather than demanding immediate payment of large sums, Whitmore gradually convinced Douglas that his stolen money represented spiritual poison that needed to be purged through charitable giving. Douglas was encouraged to make increasingly substantial donations to support the monastery's mission, with each contribution celebrated as evidence of his growing spiritual maturity. Within 6 weeks of his arrival, Douglas had turned over his entire stolen fortune to the monastery, believing that he was purchasing divine forgiveness and spiritual transformation. Whitmore assured him that his generosity had earned him a permanent place in the community, where he could serve God while being protected from the legal consequences of his past mistakes. Douglas wrote letters to associates in Salt Lake City, explaining that he had found spiritual peace in a remote location and would not be returning to his former life. Green began administering his poison blend to Douglas in early June, timing the process to coincide with what Whitmore described as the final stage of spiritual purification. Douglas was told that the physical weakness and confusion he experienced were signs that his old sinful nature was being burned away by divine fire, preparing him for spiritual rebirth. He was moved to one of the underground meditation chambers, where he could focus entirely on his relationship with God without worldly distractions. Douglas died in late June after 3 weeks of systematic poisoning, his death recorded in the monastery's official records as a peaceful transition following complete spiritual transformation. His body was buried in the monastery's expanding cemetery, marked with a simple wooden cross bearing only his initials and the date of his death. Letters were sent to his former associates, explaining that he had chosen to remain permanently at the monastery and had donated his remaining possessions to support the community's continued mission. The success with Douglas convinced Whitmore that they had perfected a system that could be repeated indefinitely with minimal risk of detection. The monastery had developed efficient methods for victim identification, recruitment, psychological manipulation, resource extraction, and disposal that worked together as a seamless whole. More importantly, they had created a legitimate facade that could withstand casual scrutiny while providing perfect cover for their criminal activities. During the summer and fall of 1892, St. Benedict's Monastery processed 7 additional victims using their refined techniques. Each case followed the established pattern but incorporated improvements based on lessons learned from previous experiences. The monastery's underground chambers were expanded to accommodate multiple victims simultaneously, allowing them to overlap their killing cycles and increase their overall efficiency. Brother Morrison expanded his recruitment territory, traveling as far as Denver and Cheyenne to identify potential victims in larger population centers where his activities were less likely to be noticed or remembered. The monastery's reputation continued to grow through carefully placed testimonials and word-of-mouth recommendations from satisfied visitors who had experienced genuine spiritual renewal before their untimely deaths. The financial success of their operation was remarkable. By the end of 1892, the monastery had accumulated nearly $15,000 in cash and valuable possessions taken from their victims, an enormous fortune for the time period. This wealth was carefully invested in land purchases and business ventures that provided both legitimate income and additional opportunities to identify potential victims. Most chillingly, Whitmore and his associates had begun to view their activities not as criminal enterprises but as divine missions. They had convinced themselves that they were providing a valuable service to society by eliminating individuals who were too weak or corrupt to contribute meaningfully to human progress. Their victims' willingness to surrender their possessions and accept death was interpreted as evidence that they had found peace through the monastery's intervention. The psychological transformation of the perpetrators themselves was perhaps as disturbing as their crimes against victims. They had created a closed system of belief that justified any action taken in service of their supposed spiritual mission, while their isolation from outside moral influences allowed them to drift further from normal human empathy and conscience. The monastery had become a place where evil could flourish unchecked, protected by religious authority and geographic isolation from any force capable of stopping their systematic destruction of human lives. The years between 1893 and 1902 would later be remembered as the monastery's most prolific period, when St. Benedict's transformed from a regional operation into what investigators would eventually recognize as one of the most systematic killing enterprises in American history. During this decade, the monastery refined their methods to such a degree that they could process multiple victims simultaneously while maintaining the appearance of a thriving spiritual community that attracted praise from religious leaders across the mountain territories. Brother Marcus Whitmore had evolved into something far more dangerous than a simple con man or opportunistic killer. He had become a true believer in his own twisted vision, convinced that he was carrying out divine work by eliminating what he viewed as society's weakest and most corrupted members. His sermons during this period took on an increasingly apocalyptic tone, filled with references to purification through suffering and the necessity of sacrifice to achieve spiritual transcendence. The monastery's daily operations had been systematized to an extraordinary degree. New arrivals were processed through what Whitmore called the Purification Protocol, a carefully orchestrated series of psychological and physical manipulations designed to break down individual resistance while extracting maximum financial benefit. The protocol began the moment victims stepped foot on monastery grounds and continued until their deaths, typically spanning between 6 weeks and 4 months, depending on their resources and psychological resilience. Brother David Morrison had expanded his recruitment network significantly, establishing contacts in dozens of frontier towns and settlements across Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and the Dakota Territories. Morrison had developed a network of informants including bartenders, boarding house operators, and even some legitimate clergy who would alert him to individuals who matched the monastery's victim profile. These informants were paid modest fees for their information and believed they were helping troubled souls find spiritual healing rather than participating in a murder conspiracy. The recruitment advertisements had become more sophisticated as well, appearing in newspapers and religious publications throughout the region. The language was carefully crafted to appeal to specific psychological vulnerabilities while providing legal protection against fraud charges. Phrases like final sanctuary for tormented souls, healing beyond earthly medicine, and peace for those who have lost all hope attracted exactly the type of desperate individuals the monastery sought, while remaining technically truthful about the permanent nature of the sanctuary they provided. Morrison's most successful recruitment tool was what he called testimonial letters, supposedly written by former visitors to the monastery who had experienced miraculous healing and spiritual transformation. These letters were actually composed by Brother Samuel Green, who had developed considerable skill at mimicking different handwriting styles and creating convincing personal narratives. The letters would appear in local newspapers as paid advertisements, or would be shared privately with potential victims as evidence of the monastery's effectiveness. The case of Eleanor Hartwell demonstrated the deadly efficiency of the monastery's mature operation. Hartwell was a 38-year-old schoolteacher from Bozeman who had developed a severe laudanum addiction following a riding accident that left her in chronic pain. Her addiction had cost her both her teaching position and her engagement to a local merchant, leaving her socially isolated and financially desperate. Morrison encountered her during one of his regular visits to Bozeman, immediately recognizing her as an ideal candidate for the monastery's services. Hartwell possessed several characteristics that made her particularly valuable as a victim. She had inherited a modest but significant sum from her deceased parents, She had no close family members who would pursue intensive searches if she disappeared, and her addiction had made her desperate enough to try any treatment that promised relief from her suffering. Most importantly, her professional background as an educator meant she could write convincing letters that would satisfy any casual inquiries about her well-being and whereabouts. Morrison approached Hartwell with exceptional care, spending several weeks building her trust before mentioning the monastery. He presented himself as a fellow sufferer who had overcome similar struggles through the spiritual healing he had found. At St. Benedict's, he shared carefully crafted stories about other addiction sufferers who had found peace and recovery through the monastery's unique approach to treating ailments that conventional medicine could not cure. Hartwell arrived at the monastery in September 1894, carrying nearly $1,200 in cash and jewelry along with her personal possessions. She was immediately impressed by the apparent serenity of the community and the warm welcome she received from Whitmore and his associates. The monastery's reputation for helping individuals overcome various forms of suffering had grown considerably, and Hartwell felt fortunate to have been accepted into what seemed like an exclusive healing community. Whitmore spent considerable time with Hartwell during her first weeks at St. Benedict's, listening to her struggles with addiction while gradually introducing the theological framework that would justify her eventual murder. He explained that her physical suffering was actually a manifestation of spiritual corruption that could only be cleansed through complete surrender to divine will. Her laudanum addiction was reframed as evidence of her soul's desperate hunger for spiritual fulfillment that had been misdirected toward earthly substances. The financial extraction from Hartwell followed the monastery's refined protocol but incorporated new techniques developed specifically for educated victims who might be more resistant to crude manipulation. Rather than demanding immediate large donations, Whitmore convinced Hartwell that her money itself was spiritually contaminated by her sinful past and needed to be purified through charitable giving. She was encouraged to make increasingly substantial contributions to support the monastery's mission of helping other suffering souls find healing. Hartwell's addiction actually made her easier to control than many victims, as Green was able to regulate her laudanum supply to create physical dependency alongside the psychological manipulation. He gradually reduced her access to the drug while introducing small amounts of his poison blend, creating symptoms that Hartwell interpreted as withdrawal effects rather than signs of systematic poisoning. Her desperation for relief made her increasingly willing to accept any explanation for her suffering and any treatment that promised eventual peace. The monastery had also developed new methods for extracting additional value from educated victims like Hartwell. She was encouraged to write detailed accounts of her spiritual journey and healing experiences, documents that were later used as testimonials to attract other victims. Her teaching skills were put to use instructing other residents in reading and writing, making her a valuable resource for the community's operations while she remained alive and functional. Hartwell's death in January 1895 was recorded as a peaceful transition following complete spiritual transformation and freedom from her earthly addictions. Her body was buried in the monastery's expanding cemetery with a simple marker noting her dates of birth and death, along with a religious inscription about finding peace through surrender. Letters written in her handwriting, actually forged by Green, were sent to former associates in Bozeman, explaining that she had found such profound healing and spiritual fulfillment at the monastery that she had chosen to remain permanently as a teaching member of the community. The monastery's cemetery had grown to contain over 40 graves by this point, a development that actually enhanced their legitimacy rather than raising suspicions. Local residents viewed the expanding burial ground as evidence of the monastery's dedication to caring for society's most desperate and forgotten members. The simple wooden crosses and religious inscriptions created an atmosphere of humble devotion that impressed visiting clergy and government officials who occasionally toured the facility. Brother Thomas Caldwell had developed increasingly sophisticated security measures to prevent escapes and maintain complete control over the monastery's population. The compound now included multiple layers of barriers and monitoring systems that made unauthorized departure virtually impossible. Guard dogs patrolled the perimeter during nighttime hours, ostensibly to protect against wild animals, but actually trained to prevent human movement in either direction. The underground chamber system had been expanded significantly, now including more than a dozen separate rooms connected by narrow tunnels carved directly into the mountain bedrock. These chambers served multiple purposes. They provided secure holding areas for victims during their final weeks of life. They offered completely private locations for torture and interrogation when necessary, and they included specialized rooms equipped for body preparation and temporary storage before burial. Caldwell had also established what he called the discipline protocol for residents who showed signs of resistance or attempted to leave the monastery without permission. Troublesome individuals would be subjected to increasingly severe punishments, disguised as spiritual penances, including extended periods of solitary confinement, restriction of food and water, and physical abuse justified as necessary for spiritual purification. These measures were rarely needed, as the monastery's psychological manipulation techniques were generally sufficient to maintain control, but they provided effective deterrence for anyone who might consider rebellion. The monastery's legitimate operations had expanded considerably during this period, providing both additional income and enhanced cover for their criminal activities. They now operated a successful farm that supplied produce to nearby settlements, a woodworking shop that created furniture and religious artifacts for sale throughout the region, and even a small publishing operation that produced religious books and pamphlets. These enterprises employed some of the monastery's longer-term residents and provided tangible evidence of their productive contribution to the local community. Brother Samuel Green had become increasingly sophisticated in his poison research, developing new compounds and delivery methods that could produce virtually any desired effect. His laboratory now included an extensive library of medical and botanical texts along with carefully organized samples of dozens of toxic plants and minerals. Green maintained detailed records of his experiments, including precise measurements of dosages, timing of effects, and post-mortem observations that helped him refine his techniques. Green's most significant innovation during this period was the development of what he called graduated poisoning, a technique that allowed him to control the pace and manner of a victim's death with extraordinary precision. By carefully adjusting the types and amounts of toxins administered over time, he could create death scenarios that perfectly matched whatever cover story the monastery needed for each individual case. Heart failure, consumption, mountain fever, and even apparent accidents could all be produced on demand through his chemical manipulations. The psychological profiles of victims had been refined as well, with the monastery now targeting specific categories of individuals who offered the best combination of resources and vulnerability. Widowed women with inheritance money were particularly prized, as were men suffering from war injuries or trauma who carried military pensions or disability payments. Individuals with chronic illnesses often brought substantial savings accumulated for medical treatments, while those fleeing legal troubles frequently carried significant amounts of cash. The monastery had also begun targeting whole families in certain circumstances, recognizing that group victims could provide larger financial payoffs while actually being easier to eliminate without detection. Families traveling west who had become separated from larger wagon trains were ideal targets, as were immigrant families who had few connections in America and limited English language skills that made them unlikely to attract attention if they disappeared. The case of the Weber family illustrated this expanded approach to victim selection. Heinrich and Greta Weber had emigrated from Germany with their 3 teenage children, carrying nearly $3,000 in gold coins intended to purchase farmland in Oregon. The family had become separated from their wagon train during a river crossing and had wandered for days through the Montana mountains before Morrison encountered them during one of his recruitment trips. Morrison convinced the desperate family that the monastery could provide temporary shelter while they recovered from their ordeal and planned their continued journey west. The Webbers arrived at St. Benedict's in August 1896, grateful for the apparent kindness and hospitality they received from the religious community. Whitmore spent considerable time with Heinrich Weber, learning about the family's resources and travel plans, while gradually introducing the theological justification for what would become their systematic murder. The elimination of the Weber family required nearly 4 months and demonstrated the monastery's ability to handle complex operations involving multiple victims with different psychological profiles and resistance levels. Each family member was subjected to individualized manipulation designed to break down their relationships with each other while increasing their dependence on the monastery community. The parents were gradually convinced that their children's souls were in spiritual danger and needed intensive religious intervention, while the children were told that their parents' old world beliefs were hindering their spiritual development in the new world. The Webbers' deaths were staggered over several weeks and attributed to various causes including mountain fever, heart failure, and a supposed accident involving one of the teenage sons. Their substantial gold reserves were divided among several monastery investment accounts, while their personal possessions were distributed or sold through the community's legitimate business operations. Letters were sent to relatives in Germany explaining that the family had decided to settle permanently in Montana and had donated their resources to support the monastery's mission of helping other immigrant families find spiritual and practical assistance in America. The beginning of the end for St. Benedict's Monastery came not from external investigation or suspicious relatives, but from an unexpected source within their own carefully controlled environment. Brother Francis Kowalski had arrived at the monastery in the spring of 1903 as what appeared to be another ideal victim, a Polish immigrant suffering from severe melancholia following the death of his wife and infant son in a tenement fire in Chicago. Kowalski carried nearly $800 in savings and insurance money, had few connections in America, and displayed the kind of profound despair that typically made victims eager to embrace the monastery's promise of spiritual healing. What Brother Marcus Whitmore and his associates failed to recognize was that Kowalski possessed something that set him apart from their usual victims: genuine religious training and a deep understanding of Christian theology that would eventually allow him to see through their carefully constructed facade. Kowalski had studied for the priesthood in Poland before emigrating to America, and although he had abandoned his religious vocation after losing his family, his theological knowledge remained intact. More dangerously still, his grief had not broken his spirit, but had instead sharpened his moral clarity and strengthened his commitment to justice. Kowalski's first weeks at St. Benedict's followed the monastery's standard protocol, with Whitmore personally conducting the intensive spiritual counseling sessions, designed to break down psychological resistance while extracting information about financial resources. However, Kowalski began noticing inconsistencies in the monastery's religious practices that troubled his trained theological mind. The daily prayers contained subtle but significant deviations from Orthodox Christian doctrine. The biblical quotations used in sermons were often taken out of context or deliberately misinterpreted. And most disturbing of all, the underlying theology seemed focused more on submission to earthly authority than on genuine spiritual development. During his third week at the monastery, Kowalski witnessed something that shattered any remaining belief in the legitimacy of the religious community. While walking near the cemetery during the early morning hours, he observed Brother Samuel Green and Brother Thomas Caldwell digging what appeared to be a fresh grave, despite the fact that no death had been announced to the community. More troubling still, the two men were handling what looked like human remains wrapped in canvas, Working with the efficient precision of individuals who had performed this task many times before, Kowalski retreated without being observed, but the incident prompted him to begin paying closer attention to the monastery's operations. He started keeping a mental record of community members who seemed to disappear without explanation, noting that new arrivals would often participate in community activities for several weeks before gradually becoming less visible and eventually vanishing entirely. The official explanations for these disappearances varied, but they all shared certain characteristics that struck Kowalski as suspiciously convenient. The discovery that would ultimately expose the monastery's crimes came when Kowalski gained access to Brother Green's private quarters while the community was gathered for evening prayers. Hidden beneath Green's bed, Kowalski found a wooden box containing detailed notes about various plant toxins, including precise measurements for lethal doses and descriptions of symptoms produced by different poisonous compounds. Most damning of all were Green's clinical observations about the effects of these substances on specific individuals, notes that clearly documented the systematic poisoning of dozens of monastery residents. Among Green's papers, Kowalski also discovered forged letters written in various handwriting styles, practice sheets where Green had obviously been learning to mimic the writing of different individuals, and worst of all, a ledger book that appeared to catalog the personal possessions and financial resources of community members who had supposedly left the monastery or died of natural causes. The ledger contained detailed inventories of jewelry, cash, and other valuables along with notes about how these items had been disposed of or converted to monastery assets. Kowalski faced a terrible dilemma. The evidence he had discovered proved beyond any doubt that St. Benedict's monastery was engaged in systematic murder, but his own situation made it extremely difficult to alert outside authorities without risking his own life. The monastery's remote location meant that any attempt to leave would be immediately noticed, while the community's tight control over communications made it impossible to send messages to law enforcement without detection. The solution came when Kowalski remembered that Brother David Morrison made regular trips to nearby settlements for supplies and recruitment activities. During one of Morrison's absences, Kowalski managed to convince Brother Caldwell that he needed to travel to Copper Falls to settle some urgent financial matters related to his deceased wife's estate. Caldwell was initially suspicious, but Kowalski's apparent cooperation with the monastery's program and his willingness to leave behind his savings as security for his return eventually convinced Caldwell to grant permission for the trip. The journey to Copper Falls took Kowalski 2 days through treacherous mountain terrain, but he finally reached the settlement and immediately sought out the local sheriff, a grizzled frontier lawman named William Tanner who had been maintaining law and order in the region for over 15 years. Tanner initially received Kowalski's story with considerable skepticism, as the Polish immigrant's limited English and obvious emotional distress made his account seem potentially unreliable. However, Kowalski's detailed knowledge of the monastery's layout and operations, combined with his ability to provide specific names and dates, gradually convinced Tanner that he was dealing with something far more serious than the ravings of a disturbed individual. Sheriff Tanner faced significant challenges in investigating Kowalski's allegations. The monastery's location in a remote mountain valley made surveillance extremely difficult, while their reputation as a legitimate religious community meant that any aggressive investigation would likely generate political pressure from religious leaders throughout the territory. Most problematically, Tanner lacked the manpower and resources necessary to conduct a full-scale raid on a fortified compound that might contain dozens of armed defenders. Tanner's breakthrough came when he contacted federal authorities in Helena and discovered that the United States Marshal Service had been quietly investigating reports of missing persons throughout Montana Territory. Deputy Marshal Robert Crawford had been tracking patterns of disappearances that seemed to cluster around certain geographic areas, and the region around St. Benedict's Monastery had generated more missing persons reports than any other location in the territory. Crawford's files contained the names of more than 30 individuals who had last been seen traveling toward the monastery's general area, a statistical anomaly that could not be explained by the normal hazards of frontier travel. The federal investigation accelerated rapidly once Crawford and Tanner began comparing their information. They discovered that many of the missing persons had responded to newspaper advertisements or personal recruitment efforts that could be traced back to the monastery's agents. More damaging still, several of the supposedly voluntary letters received from missing individuals contained writing anomalies and factual errors that suggested they had been composed by someone other than their purported authors. The raid on St. Benedict's Monastery was planned with military precision, recognizing that the isolated compound might well be defended by individuals willing to fight rather than surrender. Crawford assembled a force of 12 federal marshals and territorial deputies, supported by a detachment of cavalry from Fort Assiniboine, who were officially present to provide logistical support, but were actually prepared to engage in combat if necessary. The operation was scheduled for dawn on October 23, 1903, when the monastery's residents would be gathered for morning prayers and least likely to notice the approaching law enforcement officers. The assault on the monastery compound proceeded with surprising ease, as the religious community's routines made them vulnerable to coordinated attack despite their extensive security measures. The main gate was breached simultaneously with attacks on 2 other sections of the perimeter wall, creating multiple entry points that prevented any organized resistance. Most of the monastery's residents surrendered immediately when confronted by armed federal officers, though Brother Caldwell attempted to destroy evidence by setting fire to several buildings before being subdued and arrested. Brother Marcus Whitmore was captured in the chapel, where he had apparently been conducting morning prayers, as if nothing unusual was happening. Even when confronted with armed federal marshals, Whitmore maintained his pose as a legitimate religious leader, demanding to know by what authority they were violating the sanctity of a consecrated religious community. His performance might have been convincing to casual observers, but the federal agents had come prepared with specific evidence and were not impressed by his theatrical protests of innocence. The search of the monastery compound revealed evidence that exceeded even the investigators' worst expectations. Brother Green's laboratory contained an extensive collection of poisons, along with detailed notes documenting their use on specific individuals. The monastery's underground chambers yielded physical evidence of imprisonment and torture, including restraints, bloodstains, and personal possessions belonging to missing persons. Most damning of all was the monastery cemetery, which contained far more graves than could be accounted for by the natural death rate of a small religious community. The excavation of the cemetery began immediately, with federal authorities working alongside local volunteers to uncover the full extent of the monastery's crimes. The first graves opened contained the bodies of recent victims, individuals who could still be identified through personal effects and physical characteristics. As the excavation continued, investigators discovered layer upon layer of human remains, representing nearly 2 decades of systematic murder. The condition of the older remains made individual identification impossible, but the sheer number of bodies provided overwhelming evidence of the monastery's criminal activities. Brother Samuel Green proved to be the most cooperative of the captured conspirators, apparently hoping that his assistance with the investigation might result in a reduced sentence. Green provided detailed confessions about the monastery's operations, including specific information about individual victims and the methods used to kill them. His clinical approach to murder had led him to maintain meticulous records, and these documents provided investigators with a comprehensive picture of one of the most systematic killing operations in American criminal history. The confession revealed that the monastery had claimed 189 victims over the course of 19 years, ranging from individual travelers to entire families who had been systematically exploited and murdered. The victims represented a cross-section of frontier society, immigrants seeking new opportunities, individuals fleeing personal tragedies, families traveling west in search of better lives, and countless others who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time when they encountered the monastery's recruitment network. Brother David Morrison was captured several days after the initial raid, apprehended while attempting to flee toward the Canadian border with a substantial amount of cash and jewelry taken from monastery victims. Morrison's attempt to escape actually provided additional evidence of the conspiracy, as the valuables in his possession could be linked to specific missing persons through family descriptions and identifying marks. His detailed knowledge of the monastery's recruitment operations would later prove crucial in understanding the full scope of their criminal enterprise. The investigation revealed that the monastery's financial success had been extraordinary, with the conspirators accumulating wealth equivalent to hundreds of thousands of modern dollars through their systematic exploitation of victims. This money had been invested in legitimate businesses and real estate throughout Montana Territory, creating a complex web of financial holdings that took investigators months to unravel completely. The monastery had essentially built a criminal empire disguised as a religious community, using their victims' resources to expand their operations and attract even more victims. Brother Thomas Caldwell proved to be the most defiant of the captured conspirators, maintaining his innocence despite overwhelming evidence of his participation in the murders. Caldwell's military background had made him the monastery's security chief, responsible for preventing escapes and maintaining discipline among victims during their final weeks of life. His detailed knowledge of the underground chamber system and body disposal procedures provided investigators with crucial evidence about the mechanics of the monastery's killing operation. The discovery of detailed victim records maintained by the monastery revealed the systematic nature of their crimes in horrifying detail. Each victim had been carefully evaluated for their financial resources, psychological vulnerabilities, and likelihood of being missed by outside associates. The records included personal information extracted during counseling sessions, inventories of possessions and money, and even physical descriptions that helped investigators identify remains found in the cemetery. The psychological manipulation techniques employed by the monastery were revealed to be far more sophisticated than initially understood. Whitmore and his associates had developed detailed profiles of different victim types and had created specific approaches for exploiting the psychological vulnerabilities of each category. Their success rate in breaking down victim resistance was nearly 100%, suggesting a level of psychological expertise that went far beyond simple con artistry. The monastery's legitimate business operations had provided perfect cover for their criminal activities, while also generating additional income that supported their expansion. The farm, woodworking shop, and publishing operation had employed some of the longer-term residents and had created tangible evidence of productive community activity that impressed visitors and deflected suspicion from local authorities. The investigation also revealed the extent to which the monastery had infiltrated local social and religious networks. Several legitimate clergy members had unknowingly assisted the monastery's recruitment efforts by referring troubled parishioners who they believed could benefit from spiritual counseling. Local business owners had provided goods and services to the monastery without suspecting the true nature of their activities, while territorial officials had occasionally visited the compound and had come away impressed by the apparent success of the religious community. The evidence collected during the investigation filled dozens of boxes and provided investigators with the most complete picture of a systematic murder operation that ever been assembled in American criminal justice history. The meticulous records kept by the conspirators, combined with the physical evidence found at the monastery, created an overwhelming case that would prove impossible for defense attorneys to challenge effectively. Francis Kowalski's courage in exposing the monastery's crimes had prevented countless additional murders and had brought justice to the families of 189 victims. His willingness to risk his own life to alert authorities demonstrated that even in the darkest circumstances, individual moral courage could triumph over systematic evil. The investigation that followed his revelations would transform understanding of criminal psychology and would establish new protocols for investigating organized crime that remained influential for decades. The trial of the St. Benedict's Monastery conspirators became the most sensational legal proceeding in Montana Territory history. Federal prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of 19 years of systematic murder, supported by detailed confessions, physical evidence, and the testimony of Francis Kowalski, whose courage had exposed the entire operation. The courtroom in Helena was packed daily with spectators who struggled to comprehend the scope of the crimes committed in the name of religious salvation. Brother Marcus Whitmore faced the death penalty with the same cold arrogance he had displayed throughout his criminal career. Even when confronted with irrefutable evidence of his guilt, he maintained that he had been carrying out divine work by eliminating society's weakest members. His complete lack of remorse shocked even experienced court observers and sealed his fate with the jury. Brother Samuel Green's detailed confessions about his poison research and systematic murder methods provided prosecutors with a clear picture of the monastery's killing techniques, though his cooperation failed to save him from execution. Brother Thomas Caldwell's military background and role as the monastery's enforcer made him equally unsympathetic to the jury, while Brother David Morrison's extensive recruitment activities demonstrated his central role in the conspiracy. All 4 men were sentenced to death by hanging, their executions scheduled for March 15, 1904. The sentences were carried out as planned, with hundreds of spectators gathering to witness the end of one of America's most prolific murder conspiracies. Francis Kowalski was granted immunity in exchange for his testimony and disappeared shortly after the trial concluded. Some reports placed him in California. Others suggested he had returned to Poland, but he was never officially located again. The trauma of his experiences at the monastery and his role in exposing the crimes appeared to have left him unable to settle anywhere permanently or form lasting relationships with others who might remind him of what he had witnessed. The St. Benedict's Monastery property was seized by federal authorities and sold at auction to satisfy legal judgments against the conspirators' estates. The new owners, a mining company from Denver, demolished all the buildings and converted the land to industrial use. The underground chambers were permanently sealed, while the cemetery was relocated to consecrated ground in Copper Falls with a memorial marker commemorating the 189 victims. The case had profound implications for law enforcement techniques throughout the American West. New protocols were established for investigating missing persons cases, particularly those involving religious communities or isolated establishments that served transient populations. The detailed records kept by the monastery conspirators provided criminal investigators with unprecedented insight into the psychology and methods of systematic killers, influencing investigative techniques that remained in use well into the 20th century. Modern criminologists who have studied the St. Benedict's case note that it represents one of the earliest documented examples of what would later be recognized as organized serial killing. The monastery's systematic approach to victim selection, psychological manipulation, and body disposal demonstrated a level of criminal sophistication that was previously unknown in American criminal history. The case established precedents for investigating similar crimes and highlighted the vulnerability of isolated individuals in frontier society. The financial investigation revealed that the conspirators had accumulated enormous wealth through their systematic exploitation of victims. Money that was used to compensate surviving family members where possible and to fund improvements to Law enforcement capabilities in remote areas of Montana Territory. The monastery's legitimate business operations were dissolved, but their success had demonstrated how criminal enterprises could hide behind respectable facades for extended periods. Without detection. Local folklore in northern Montana preserved distorted versions of the St. Benedict story for generations, with some tales portraying the conspirators as supernatural entities rather than human criminals. The truth, as revealed by court records and contemporary accounts, proved far more disturbing than any ghost story could convey. The monastery had exploited the most fundamental human needs for spiritual comfort and community belonging, transforming these vulnerabilities into weapons against the desperate and lonely. The physical location of St. Benedict's Monastery remained a source of local superstition well into the modern era. Hikers and hunters reported finding unusual artifacts in the area, though whether these discoveries were genuine relics or products of imagination influenced by the site's notorious history was never definitively determined. The possibility that additional burial sites might exist in the surrounding wilderness continued to attract amateur investigators, though no systematic searches were ever conducted. The case files from the St. Benedict's investigation, housed in the Montana State Archives, continue to attract researchers fascinated by one of America's most systematic criminal enterprises. The detailed documentation provides an unusually complete picture of how such crimes were planned and executed in the 19th century, offering insights into criminal psychology that remain relevant to modern investigators. The story of St. Benedict's Monastery serves as a chilling reminder that evil can flourish in the most unexpected places, protected by isolation and disguised by apparent respectability. The 189 victims who died in those mountain chambers represent not just individual tragedies, but a collective warning about the dangers faced by society's most vulnerable members when they encounter predators skilled in exploiting their deepest needs and fears. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.